This is a reading from the book entitled Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. Satan at Lourdes, a little town. If the obscure village of Ars owes its reputation solely to its saintly curé, in the sense that it was totally unknown before his time, the same is not true of Lourdes. Abel Hugo, the elder brother of Victor Hugo, described it thus in his France Pittoresque, published in 1835. This capital of the former L'Avédan en Bigorre used to be called Mirambel, which means in the local patois, the beautiful view. Lourdes had an old castle, mainly used since the 14th century as a state prison. The castle, writes Abel Hugo, had just been restored, and he adds, the town clusters round a rock on the opposite side of the Gave, and extends into a ravine through which runs a swift stream. Solidly built, but irregular, it has no particular buildings of note, but it is well placed at the junction of four valleys, through which pass the roads to Pau, Tarbes, Barèges, and Bagnères. But it was not for the beautiful view that millions of pilgrims flocked to Lourdes in 1958. The year that marked the centenary of the appearances. We know well what these appearances were. On the 11th of February, 1858, Bernadette Soubirous, a young girl, simple, poor, ignorant, but very pious, suddenly became aware of a young girl in white in the entry to the Grotto of Massabielle, in the hollow of a rock. The vision was repeated 18 times between the 11th of February and the 16th of July, but we do not need to repeat the rest of the story, which is already well known throughout the world. What is relevant here is the devil's intervention in this extraordinary episode. Silence or absence on his part would be astonishing, since he had been remarkably active at Ars in troubling a saint. He would therefore hardly be absent when miracles were occurring in the grotto at Lourdes. All the many authors who have written about Lourdes have stressed the element of demonic intervention. This took the form of what is known in theology as infestation, and in the case under consideration, it had truly satanic grotesqueness. The first alert. According to J.B. Estrade, one of the first reporters of these appearances or visions, there may well have been a first alert on February 11th during the first vision. As Bernadette was returning to the town from the grotto, she is supposed to have declared that the vision had been disturbed by strange and unaccustomed noises. These sounds seemed to rise from the river Gave. There were many sounds seeming to echo and reply to each other. There were voices, questioning, contradicting, shouting, like the voices of a crowd in tumult. Amidst all these confusing voices, one more distinct than the rest could be heard uttering the furious, menacing cry, "Flee! Flee!" Bernadette understood immediately that this injunction was addressed less to her, too insignificant to be dangerous, than to the young girl in white who had appeared to her ecstatic gaze, and whose name she did not yet know. But, according to J.B. Estrade, the vision of light had only to turn her eyes for a moment towards the point where the voices appeared to come, and her one look was so effective, so endowed with sovereign authority, that the voices immediately fell silent. J.B. Estrade declared that the story of this first alert was related directly by Bernadette to him and his sister. The Abbé Nogaro, vicar of the Cathedral of Tarbes, was also informed of it by the ecstatic herself. We consider, therefore, as does Monseigneur Trochu, that the facts are incontrovertible, but the actual date seems less certain. As a matter of fact, Father Cross, S.J., who has made such a detailed study of the visions, does not mention it, either on the 11th of February or later. Since Father Cross has more than once had occasion to question the accuracy of the worthy Monsieur Estrade's memory, one is inclined to believe that he had misstated this episode too, by antedating it considerably. We do not consider the episode spurious, but merely that it should be placed much later. We now come to instances of demonic activity which are better dated and more reliable. Since we propose only to deal with well-attested facts, we shall follow very closely the account given by Father Cross. Footnote. See also that valuable work, Histoire de Notre-Dame de Lourdes, based on official records and the evidence of witnesses by L.J.M. Cross, S.J., Paris, Beauchesne, 1927, particularly Volume 2, page 47, Et sec and passim. First to the facts, and then to the interpretation. Many visionaries. On Thursday, 15th of April, the mayor of Lourdes, Monsieur Lacadet, made a preliminary report to the sub-prefect of Argel on visionaries other than Bernadette Soubirous. We must note the date. According to Father Cross's calculation, there had already been 18 appearances from the 11th of February to the 7th of April. Footnote. We know that Bernadette had one further vision on the 16th of July, but Father Cross does not include it. For him, the series ended on the 7th of April. The series was therefore completed. Bernadette remained aloof from all that followed. Here is the mayor's report. Last Saturday, 10th of April, he wrote, 3 girls from Lourdes were praying in the grotto at 2 in the afternoon, when, according to them, the Blessed Virgin appeared to them. One of them has made a written deposition which is in the hands of the curé, who has forwarded it to the bishop. A certain Pauline Labonte, who went to the grotto yesterday morning, 14th of April at 10 o'clock, in order to pray, declares that she saw the Blessed Virgin. This was only the beginning. Then, the highly conscientious police superintendent, Monsieur Jacomet, made his report, as in duty bound, first to the sub-prefect, then to the prefect. The visionaries waxed and multiplied. Bernadette, one might almost say, was put in the shade. She could no longer compete with so many others who were seeing marvels. The superintendent was precise in his details, which are invaluable in helping us to assess the worth of these new visions. They never occurred in the exact place where Bernadette had seen the Blessed Virgin and heard her name from her own mouth. Some invisible protection seemed to encircle the spot, and also the person of Bernadette herself, whereas she always remained completely natural, that is, just what she was, very simple, very modest, very ignorant, but totally sincere and upright. Other characteristics are to be found among these new visionaries. On the 10th of April, there were 5 of them, and not 3, as stated in the mayor's first report. One of them, wrote the police superintendent, is Claire Marie Cazenave, 22 years old, a virtuous girl, very religious, and with a powerful imagination. I saw, she says, a white stone, and at almost the same time the shape of a woman of normal height, supporting a child on her left arm. Her face was smiling. Her curly hair fell to her shoulders. On her head was something white, held in place by a sort of comb. Then a white dress. As for the child, I did not see him very clearly the first time, and I did not see him at all later. The second, Madeleine Cazot, 45 years old, married, of bad reputation, and addicted to drink, describes her vision thus. I saw something on the white stone, about the size of a 10-year-old girl. Over her head she had a white veil, which fell to her shoulders. Her hair was long and covered her breast. Every time the candle was moved, the figure disappeared. The third, Honorine Lacroix, over 40 years old, a prostitute with a bad reputation, says that she was the first to see the Blessed Virgin. The Virgin, she says, looked like a little girl of 4, covered by a white veil. Her hair fell to her shoulders and was swept back over her forehead. Her eyes were blue, her hair blonde, the lower half of her face very white, and her cheeks pink. As for the 2 foreign women, one of whom is also said to have seen the vision, no one has heard any more of them. No one knows where they are. All this, even at first glance, is more than a little suspicious, but the sight of these alleged visions is no less suspect. The sight. We are indebted to the same superintendent of police for a careful description of the sight. After Bernadette's visions, the grotto had become a popular resort for pilgrims, and a rough altar had been set up on which visitors laid offerings of wild or garden flowers. The shape of the grotto was roughly that of an oven, about 13 feet deep, with a domed roof about 8 or 9 feet high. At a height of about 8 feet in the roof of the grotto, that is to say, at a point which could only be reached with the help of a small ladder, a narrow corridor led out of the grotto and turned sharply into the interior of the rock. This corridor was about 13 feet long and led into an oval opening about 8 feet in diameter. Beyond this, the corridor narrowed again. At a further 13 or 14 feet along, the way was blocked, but by the light of candles, it was possible to see some whitish rock surfaces. It is clear that in order to get into this hollow in the rocks, it would be necessary to crawl along one's stomach, a very awkward business, and for a woman somewhat grotesque. In addition, the clairvoyants had not brought a ladder, as was later done. They had climbed sacrilegiously onto the altar at the back of the grotto in order to be able to climb into the mysterious corridor. Their illumination was provided by candles, and no doubt their fitful light cast shadows which, with a little imagination, could be variously interpreted as a woman of normal size, a girl of 10, or even of 4. The superintendent expressed his disapproval very clearly. The first time these women ventured to visit the spot I have described was on Saturday, 10th of April. Neither decency nor respect for the altar they had to trample on held them back. There were 5 of them, a curious group in view of the differences of age, habits, and way of living. The first visit did not attract much attention. Marie Cazenave, the most honorable of the 3 visionaries, so-called, seems, according to the superintendent, to have been ashamed of what her rather disreputable companions claimed to have seen. But the story got about all the same. Curiosity proved sharper than natural respect. Other women climbed into the hollow in the rock. Many of them saw nothing and returned somewhat abashed. But on the 14th of April, Suzette Levant, a servant aged 50, climbed into the gallery and returned transported. She was surrounded by eager questioners. She had seen. She was still shaking all over. What had she seen? A white form about my own size, a sort of vapor, like a veil, and beneath it a long, trailing gown. But I could not see any human form, neither head nor shoulders, nor legs, nor any part of the body. In any case, she added, what I saw was so vague and confused that I can't make out what it was. These few happenings were enough to fan the flames. From then onwards, pilgrimages to this most inaccessible gallery were multiplied. On the 17th of April, both men and women joined in this questionable exploration. A young girl, Josephine Albario, aged 15, began to cry and show signs of agitation. She was comforted and brought down from the gallery. It was necessary to take her home and put her to bed. She declared that she had seen the Immaculate Conception carrying a child in her arms, and standing beside her a man with a long beard, and this same vision seemed to haunt her even at her bedside. Public opinion was in turmoil. 2 currents of opinion began to form. Some were full of admiration, believing in every apparition, whether to Bernadette or to her emulators. Others, shocked by many details in the accounts of these new visions, no longer believed even in those vouchsafed to Bernadette. The confusion was extreme. On 18th of April, the mayor's own servant was seized with convulsions because she too had seen something, but she had not needed even to climb into the rocky corridor, for the convulsions occurred as she was telling her beads in front of the altar in the grotto. The mayor had complete confidence in his servant. He determined to investigate whether some trick of light might not have occasioned the visions which were turning the heads of so many women. On the 19th of April, a small investigating committee climbed into the upper grotto in order to clear the matter up and to see whether the visions, particularly the visions seen by Josephine Albario, which had led to an ecstasy of 3/4 of an hour, might have some natural explanation. but the results of the investigation were purely negative. We should note, however, that the appearances to Bernadette had occurred in quite different circumstances from those we have just described, but it is clear that the public tended to confuse the two. Serious-minded people, such as Superintendent Jacomet, thereby felt justified in dismissing both without further ado, as attributable to regrettable delusions. On 18th of April, the Procureur, M. Dutour, wrote to the Procureur Général to complain of the attitude of the clergy. Nothing is being done to restrain religious sentiment from becoming ever more deeply committed to the path it is already pursuing, misled either by folly or deliberate deceit. Visions abound. Miracles are too frequent to relate. The clergy and the mayor seem to be content merely to record them. And he repeats, like Jacomet, the story of all the new visions. It is now obvious that towards the end of April 1858, public confusions with regard to the appearances was at its height. First years. There was, however, one voice to be heard amidst all this confusion, which we should note as providing some principle of clarification. There were, as we said, two trends of opinion, either to accept and wonder at everything, or to discredit and discard everything. The first quiet suggestion of what would afterwards be recognized as the truth came from a priest. At about this time, the visionaries included a certain Marie Bernard of Carrère-Basse. She claimed, said the Abbé Pen, that she had seen a group of 3 persons in the grotto, a man with a white beard, a fairly young woman, and a child. The old man had a bunch of keys in one hand, and with the other was twisting his mustache. It was at first said in the town that it might be the Holy Family. The same vision reappeared later, with the addition that the same persons had indulged in indecent gestures. Neither I nor my sister were able to establish whether these gestures had been observed by the same visionary or by others who had had the same vision. The girl, however, was my penitent, and often told me the same story, to which I paid little attention, considering that it was nothing but a trick of the devil designed to cast a shadow on the earlier appearances. The italics are ours. They seem, in fact, to suggest the most reasonable explanation for all the phenomena quoted. Whether or not one attributes the visions which followed on the appearances to Bernadette to exaltation, imagination, or mental confusion, it is clear that the advantage derived from them was in favor of the powers of evil, and that in all these episodes of which we have described only a few, we can begin to see the first outline of a purpose, that the authentic visions and well-established appearances of the Blessed Virgin should be smothered under a flood of odd or grotesque imitations, which would later be absorbed enthusiastically by some of the population of Lourdes, whilst the more circumspect would merely shrug their shoulders. To drown truth in falsehood is a truly diabolical activity. Later events were to confirm this first interpretation of events. It should be noted in passing that all the latter opposition to belief in the authentic appearances to Bernadette had at least one good effect, in that it restrained or repressed the more extreme forms of demonic manifestation. With the passage of time, it became clear that it was not a question of either accepting or rejecting everything, but simply of making a distinction. The most fully accredited of all these visionaries was the young Josephine Albario, but in her case there was rather too much excitement and agitation and too many tears. Monsieur Estrade, whom we have often quoted and whose judgment is more reliable than his memory, at first placed her in his own mind on the same level as Bernadette, but later he wrote, "My admiration, however, was disturbed by an obscure feeling which seemed to warn me that the truth did not lie here. I compared the two and remembered that I felt uplifted at the story of Bernadette, whereas at the story of Josephine I was only surprised. On looking more closely into the first appearances, I was able to grasp the sense of truly divine action. On looking at the other manifestations, I could only see in them the agitation of an overexcited organism. In thinking thus, Monsieur Estrade, like other persons of good sense, was practicing that necessary act described by St. Ignatius Loyola as the discernment of spirits. And Loyola himself was only repeating, in other words, St. Paul's great precept: do not stifle the utterances of the Spirit, do not hold prophecy in low esteem, and yet you must scrutinize it all carefully, retaining only what is good. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 19 to 21. Reasonable judgments. The truth, therefore, was becoming more evident. Gradually, people's minds were becoming clearer, although, as we shall see, there was still a long way to go. But before dealing with another series of disturbances and agitation, in which the element of demonic infestation became more and more apparent, we should give some further examples of contemporary evaluation of the far too numerous visionaries competing with the humble Bernadette. We have just mentioned Josephine Albario, a young girl, incidentally of excellent character. There was another, Marie Courec, the mayor's servant. It would take too long to give her own statements, which can be found in Father Cross's book, Volume 2, page 96, et seq. What is, however, striking in a contemporary opinion expressed by a local woman, Antoinette Garros. I had no faith, she said, in Marie Courec's vision. She had neither the face nor the gestures of Bernadette. She suffered from sudden twitchings and convulsive movements. Often, when she saw her visions on the other side of the cave, she would rush forward, explaining afterwards that the vision had been calling her to the grotto. If we had not restrained her with great difficulty, she would have thrown herself into the river. One day, as I was struggling to hold her back, some people who were looking on began to shout, "Let her go! If she can cross the cave, there will be another miracle." But I did not heed them. I preferred to stop her from getting drowned. And I said to myself, if the Blessed Virgin wants her to cross the cave, she will certainly give her enough strength to get out of my grasp. The point of the examples and comments is that there is always a way of distinguishing the authentic gift, the true charism, from its demonic counterfeit. A crowd of visionaries. These disorders, to call them by their right name, were not for long confined to a few women or young girls. The visionaries of both sexes grew in number, and their generally grotesque and occasionally ridiculous posturings were to continue up to the beginning of 1859. Father Cross, some 20 years later, made an inquiry into the subject. In June 1878, he writes, we were able to unearth at Lourdes the names and histories of more than 30 of these visionaries, of both sexes and all ages, and the ones we discovered were only the best known, since no one was any longer proud of having been a visionary. Thus, Father Cross was able to prove that Superintendent Jacomet, who had often been reproached for prejudice, excessive harshness, and hostility towards anything of divine origin, had in no way exaggerated. The superintendent, in fact, was not informed of every case. He had only reported some, and either ignored or was unaware of the others. The manifestations reached such a pitch of exaggeration that they became a public scandal, and the curé of Lourdes himself was obliged to preach a solemn sermon, exhorting parents to put a stop to it by preventing their children from indulging in such unending eccentricities. When we read the evidence accumulated by Father Cross, we feel as if they were dealing with an epidemic. Here are some typical depositions. Brother Leobald, in charge of the Lourdes school. The devil prompted the appearance of a host of visionaries who indulged in the wildest extravagances. Did they really see anything? Yes, there is every reason to believe that many of them did see something. The evil one in various guises. Many of my pupils claim to have seen visions. They often played truant. These extravagances occurred not only in the grotto and by a stream which runs close to the basilica, but also in their own homes, when they improvised the little chapels. Brother Serras, a crowd of small boys and girls claimed to have seen the Blessed Virgin. I sometimes met them on their way to the grotto. They would be holding candles in their hands or kneeling down by the side of a small pond. On one of these occasions, a man said to me, "My little daughter also sees the Blessed Virgin at the grotto. So many of them do." I treated it simply as a joke, and I began seriously to doubt the value of Bernadette's visions, at which I had never been present. The italics begin are ours. Bernadette's vision was seriously endangered by this outbreak of demonic manifestations. There will be further proofs of this danger, but to continue with examples drawn from the patient investigations of Father Cross, Dominique Vigne, Marie Porteau, Dominique Cazenave, Ursule Nicolau, all excellent witnesses, have often seen visionaries at the grotto. They would snatch the bouquets of flowers that people were taking to the grotto and pluck out any lilies or roses they contained and throw them into the cave, saying, "The Virgin wants neither lilies nor roses." I heard a girl of 10 or 11 moaning, shouting, and screaming in front of the rocky hollow where the custodian's house now stands. There, she said, was the vision. This child was as much honored as the others. People would embrace them in pious devotion. Each of them held a rosary, but all the rosaries were new and unconsecrated. They did not want any others. They would hold the rosary loosely, with the crucifix on a level with their eyes, and the beads swinging in front of their faces. They used to run about in every direction, bent almost double, making strange faces and noises like young dogs baying at their prey. I once saw a procession of them coming from the fountain of Merlas as far as the post which had the notice telling you not to go into the grotto. When they got there, one of them shouted, "Come with me, you will see the Blessed Virgin." Some women joined the procession and followed them. One evening, when night had already fallen, one of the visionaries, crowned with a laurel wreath, cried out, "All of you are to recite a rosary. The Lord is going to recite the rosary." It was no use pointing out that to suggest that God was going to pray to the Virgin Mary was turning the world upside down. They were carried away. A little later, the visionary called out, "Kiss the ground 40 times! 40 times!" All present kissed the ground. As for myself, I laughed, but I was secretly furious at seeing all these devilments. Mademoiselle Tardivaille. One has no idea nowadays of the credulity that prevailed in Lourdes at that time. People's minds were aflame. A stranger coming from Saint Pé declared on entering the town, "I looked at the grotto as I passed. There I saw the Blessed Virgin, who was walking about. Everyone saw her. A crowd of people thereupon rushed to the grotto. My sister and I were among them." Jean Dominguez. One day from the Ribert, I saw a visionary standing in front of the grotto, and he shouted to the dense crowd which had collected between the canal and the Gave, and which had ever spread over beyond the Gave onto the field where I was, "Bring out your rosaries, I shall bless them for you." Everyone produced a rosary, and the visionary blessed them with water from the grotto. The most revealing feature in the antics performed by these unfortunate children was their habit of making the most horrible grimaces. On this subject there is further evidence again collected by Father Cross. Gamekeeper Calais. One day I followed the visionary Barraou as far as the mill. He went into a bedroom and started climbing up the curtains of the bed. With hideous grimaces, he was grinding or gnashing his teeth, and his eyes had a wild look. Mademoiselle Prat. Once I was present when Menino was having a vision. He was braying, and his face was so terrible that I could not bear to look at it. Other witnesses have mentioned the ridiculous antics of these impromptu visionaries. They had once seen Bernadette eating grass, or at least she was said to have done so they wanted to copy her, and thus obviously brought discredit on her without intending to, for the majority behaved without any clear consciousness of the significance of their actions. But they also had activities of their own invention. Pauline Bourdoux. I have seen a dozen of them coming down our street from the grotto, with garlands of flowers round their heads. Basile Castereau. The visionary was walking through the town, wearing round his head a ribbon he had taken from a girl's hair. "The Blessed Virgin," he said, "told me to do it." A lot of people were following him. Some said he was mad, but the majority maintained he had had a vision. Mademoiselle Bopp. One day on the road to Bois, I met the visionary M in a kind of ecstasy, but with his face all awry. I shook him, but he said nothing. Finally, he came out of his ecstasy and began to move off abruptly. I asked him, "What did you see?" He would not reply and moved away. I insisted, "What did you see?" Finally, he said, just as he moved off, "The Blessed Virgin in a white robe with a crown." Just at that moment, my niece came to fetch me to see the 3 or 4 visionaries on the same road. "Come and see," she said. "There's a little girl in the most beautiful ecstasy." I saw the little girl, who was about 10 or 11, on her knees, her face transfigured. Another little visionary was passing by at the time, a candle in her hand. I took the candle and moved it backwards and forwards in front of the ecstatic's face. She never blinked an eyelid. Little by little, the ecstasy died away, and the child told us, "I saw the Blessed Virgin in a white gown with a blue sash and a crown on her head." "What did she say to you?" "She said, 'Go away, I must go to the watering pot.'" Nothing very sinister in all this, one must agree, but the real danger lay in the shadow cast on the genuine appearances to Bernadette, which had now ceased. And as a fact, people were dubious, questioning and self-questioning. Even the clearest minds were confused by this plurality of visions, some obviously spurious, and by all these alleged miracles, some of which were more than doubtful. There is a striking example of the effect of this confusion. Among those who were numbered at the outset amongst the doubters was the director of the Grand Seminary of Tarbes, Canon Ribes, who in all good faith was skeptical about all the happenings at Lourdes. He has himself related how he visited Lourdes in August 1858, accompanied by a foreign priest. Both came in quest of information. They wished, first of all, to see Bernadette. She was, after all, still the most important person at that time in Lourdes, since it was she to whom the first appearances had been vouchsafed. The 2 visitors went to Bernadette's parents and asked to see her. She was not there, so they promised to return to the mill, then owned by her father. The following scene then took place. "From the mill," said Canon Ribes, "we went to the grotto, down a little path alongside the castle. We descended a steep and barren slope, now planted with trees and made more accessible by the zigzag path so well known to pilgrims. We reached the miraculous grotto. The entry was closed by a barricade of planks. Behind it, kneeling, was a boy of about 12 or 14, fingering his rosary and bowing to a mysterious being, and moving slowly forwards towards the foot of the rock. The ground rose towards the rock in a kind of small amphitheater, in which the successive floodwaters of the Gave had cut a series of shallow steps. He studied the visionary for a few moments. His features were contracted and repellent. My companion shouted to him, "Get out of there! You're doing the devil's work!" The child, pretending not to hear, continued to move forward. "Get out of there!" he thundered at him. "Go, or the hand of God will strike you!" Immediately the visionary extinguished his little candle, climbed over the barricade, and disappeared. This was only the first episode in their investigations. The 2 priests were searching, doubting, but they knew they could not be at fault if they prayed. The story goes on. "We prayed, we drank some water from the fountain, and we went to see the curé. Bernadette was waiting for us. She related with her usual candor what she had seen and heard at the grotto. I made some remarks about the 3 secrets, which it seemed to me might be an imitation of La Salette. She replied without hesitation that the secrets had been entrusted to her alone. She was not to disclose them to anyone, not even to the Pope, and she was convinced of her ability to keep them to herself. My companion declared that he believed for myself. I was not yet convinced. I said to him, "I am inclined to believe, but I would like further proof." This hesitation was badly received by the curé of Lourdes, who was by now entirely and justifiably convinced of the authenticity of Bernadette's visions. He wrote to the bishop a few days later, saying, "How can you expect strangers to believe in the visions when the directors of the Grand Seminary are not convinced?" The next year, however, Canon Ribes returned to Lourdes to celebrate a Thanksgiving Mass for a cure obtained through the use of water from Lourdes. Monsieur le Curé remarked, to him. You owe this reparation to the Blessed Virgin for opposing her work. But he had been right in waiting for definite proofs, and in the month of August 1858, such proofs were still debatable. The devil had, as we pointed out, drowned the truth in falsehoods. With all these fantastic apparitions and alleged miracles, it is understandable that Superintendent Jacomet should have written to the prefect about the suggestion that an episcopal commission should be designated to examine the facts. Sensible and truly religious persons are wondering who has had the audacity to suggest involving the higher clergy in matters redolent of charlatanry. The prefect, however, agreed to the commission, being persuaded that it would categorically denounce all stories of visions, including those of Bernadette, which had first started the avalanche. A commission has been nominated to verify the miracles of Lourdes, wrote Monsieur Massy, the prefect of Tarbes. It is hoped that by performing its task conscientiously and without prejudice, the commission may put an end to the whole wretched business. I am willing to provide all the information necessary to prevent these allegedly supernatural incidents in their true perspective.